Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Who is missing and who is pissing? Who is missing and who is pissing? Hurry! You're gonna make me look stupid. I wanna. Okay, there we go. Going to make me look stupid, dumb, something. Who is missing and who is pissing? Hello, Brie. I need to do something really quick. Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. What's happening here? I'm trying to make a pinned message. With is that how you? Oh well, it's Okay. Did I pin it? Holy shitting. Okay, I did pin it. Okay. 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 Oh. Have fun listening to me read. I think I got everything. I would like to turn off my light because I like being in the dark. Something in the way. This is gonna be so embarrassing. So the reason I'm doing this is because I'm pretty direct at speaking, but I need to work on reading out passages because I start school in a few weeks. So this is just purely beneficial. I am on chapter 12. We're a bit far into the book, so yeah. Shortly after the first System of a Down album was released, the four of us were in a limo together, headed somewhere where I can't recall, going to do something I have no memory of. I feel a little bad that so many of my days during those hectic early years with the band are nothing but an incoherent blur. But most of the nice perks and day-to-day particulars, yeah, that came with being in a successful band were never that important to me. Regardless, I remember looking around at Darren, Chavo, and John on that ride and thinking to myself, this band isn't going to last that long. It was kind of a crazy thing to think of because really at that point the band had just started. We were all sitting in that limo, nobody was arguing, nobody had a serious drug problem, things were pretty good. Yes, Darren was complaining about something, maybe the limo itself, but surely some idle griping didn't spell doom for the whole project, right? Or maybe it did. Negativity has a way of seeping into the cracks of any foundation. I'd already spent enough time with those guys to know that what we had was combustible. And when you take something that is combustible, you seal it up for years in a tight place, then you shake it a bit and it's going to explode. System spent our first 5 years largely sealed up together in tour buses, recording studios, and rehearsal spaces. Maybe it didn't even matter who the personalities involved were. Arguably, if you put any four people in that environment for 5 years, there's going to be some volatility. Everybody has says a band is like a marriage, and I think there is some truth to that. But most bands don't start with thoughtful vows in front of friends and family and sincere reflection on the commitment you're about to make. Bands start on whims and chance. Somebody knows someone who plays bass. You need a drummer for a gig next Friday. Suddenly you find yourself married to the people you've never planned on spending the rest of your life with. When we took some time away from each other, starting in early 2003, it felt for me like a welcome and much needed bit of relief. Music had started to feel more like a job than passion. It wasn't that I needed time away from music. I just needed time away from people I've been doing it nonstop for 10 years. I still wanted to make music, I just wanted to make it differently. During that time, I reconnected with fellow musicians named Arto. I can't pronounce the last name. Who we'd worked with on the on two of the tracks for Toxicity. I'd met Arto a few years earlier at the Armenian Music Awards, where I had seen him perform, tapping on and blowing into a half-filled Coke bottle, using it as both a percussion and wind instrument at the same time. He was a tornado of creative energy. We wanted to create an album together, so we started meeting up at the studio in Burbank and finished up at the home studio in the valley. I brought some song ideas, but mostly we were just improvising, creating on the fly. Many days we'd show up in the morning with nothing and have a couple new songs recorded by the end of the day. It was so different from my experience with System, where we'd spend months writing and rehearsing material before we even stepped foot into a recording studio. I'd gotten used to thinking of the studio not as a place where ideas are born, but where they're repeated again and again and again and again until they're perfected. The process of making a System album would take 6 to 9 months. With Arto, we spent a week and a half in the studio and came out with an album. We called it Serart. What we came up with excuse me, what we came up with bore little resemblance to what I did with System. The songs in Serart are free-flowing, experimental mix of poetry, jazz, and electronic music with a globe-trotting potpourri of different strains of world music. In April of 2001, I'd done a deal with Sony that made to have my own imprint label, Surgical Strike. I wanted to use it to bring bands to people's I wanted to use it to bring bands to people's attention that normally would not be seen and put on my own record as well. Surart was the first to release on that label. It felt like the perfect mission statement for the kind of unfettered genre surpassing creativity I was hoping to foster. I signed a couple bands that I really liked, a gothy punk band called Kittens for Christian, and that band Bad Acid Trip, who had played the Second Souls show and had worked and would eventually make this amazing thrash metal meets the circus kind of album that Darren produced. But nobody embodied the label's commitment to unfettered creativity more than the enigmatic guitarist Brian Carroll, aka Buckethead. I had met him through Bill Laswell, an avant-garde bassist and producer back when Buckethead was playing guitar for Guns N' Roses. We'd send each other music or books we liked. We hang out sometimes. We talked about music. One day, Bucket called me and told me he needed money and he wanted to make an album for my label. Look, if you need money, I can give you some money, I told him. No, we don't have to make a record. No, he said. Let me make a record for you. I'd recently built an 800 square foot studio right next to my house, so we started bringing different artists to that studio to work with Bucket. Saul Williams did a track with him. The guys from Bad Acid Trip collaborated on a song. Shauna Halligan, the singer who was also a neighbor and a friend of mine, sang on a track. My friend Azam Ali was also an incredible world music singer, contributed. I wrote a couple... Oh, excuse me. I have to drink water. Cool. Where was I? I wrote a couple of songs with Bucket, played and sang on them, and co-produced the whole album. Through Bucket, I also met a guy named Dan Monty, who became a great friend and longtime collaborator. Working with Buckethead was, to put it simply, quite an experience. It was not like when he takes off the KFC bucket off his head and puts his mask away that he's just a regular guy. A regular guy he most is definitely not. Sometimes he'd call me up at 4 in.the morning, leave a 15-minute guitar solo on my voicemail. He had ambitions to open an amusement park for chickens. He is eccentric and acutely sensitive, but such a singular creative spirit. He's a sweetheart of a human being, caring, compassionate, funny. We made a couple bonkers music videos up in Big Bear for one of the songs on the album, We Are One, which Bucket plays a taxidermist who picks up a bunch of roadkill, then Frankensteins their parts into some sort of monstrous super animal. A couple of years after we made that album, he called and asked me to play a show at his old high school. I think Bucket's dad was a coach at the school, and if I remember correctly, and I may not, the event was a battle of the bands. Bucket had pulled into a few ringers of our band and introduced me, including me and Premises drummer Brian Brain Montia. We set up in the school gym and had just jammed out, with me making up the vocals as I went along, pure stream of consciousness. The kids at the school went nuts. After doing these things, I have to shift my light a little bit because I can't. It's like it's there, but it's in the completely wrong spot. Maybe I just don't use a light because I can read just fine without it. Oh no, I can't. Sending the beating to go. After doing things in such a regimented way for years with System of a Down, this This looser approach to everything was incredibly refreshing. I recorded a little with Saul Williams and played a handful of shows with him. Money Mark, a key collaborator of the Beastie Boys, and Zach De La Rocha from Rage. We didn't really have any songs. We just go on stage with a few ideas and develop them up there. I'd play an electric guitar through a bass amp. Zach was playing drums, Mark was on keyboards, and Saul would get up in front of the microphone with a newspaper and freestyle poetry inspired by the news. Of course, the output was hit and miss, but when it came together, it worked. To be there for that spark of creation was electrifying. These sorts of projects were in a way a manifestation of my spiritual journey, an artistic, big words, exoration to live in the moment. My label Surgical Strike was always conceived for an outlet of working with artists that I love. I didn't have any real commercial ambitions for it. That notwithstanding, I narrowly missed out on signing the British band Muse in 2002 and early 2003, just before they became huge stars in America. Narrowly missed out is a diplomatic way of putting it. I was kind of screwed over. I'd seen Muse play at European festivals where System was performing. At the time, the band had already had a big following in Europe, but hadn't broken in the US. In fact, their American record label, Maverick, a Warner Bros. subsidiary, run by our old buddy Guy Osery, didn't even release the second album, Origin of Symmetry, in the States. Their music was an infectious blend of progressive rock and European pop with deep-slated classical influences, but I guess the label thought American audience wouldn't get it. I spoke to their manager about trying to negotiate an exit for their Maverick deal so I could sign them, and he seemed amendable to it. The guys in the band were genuinely good dudes. They came to my house, we jammed together in my studio, they even played with my dog. Maverick wanted $500,000 to let Muse out of their contract, so I went to Sony and pitched them, essentially telling them from this money the band will be worth it, and then some. Sony hemmed and hawed. At the time, Muse was working on another album, and Sony wanted to wait to hear it before they commit to ponying up $500,000 and pry Muse away from Maverick. I have to sneeze, I think. Around this time, I was spending a lot of time in Australia and New Zealand. This is before I met Angela, and I was still trying to salvage my relationship with my ex-girlfriend who I'd met on the first trip down to Sydney. Everyone knows that long-distance relationships are tough to maintain, but I'd fallen for this Australian woman and wanted to try and make it work. I left to go down there for a few months and told my lawyer to let me know when the advanced copy of Muse's album arrived so I could pitch the band again to Sony. My lawyer failed to do that. In the meantime, at a VP, Sony tried to go behind my back and sign Muse out from under me. By the time I had heard anything about this, several months later, the whole ship had been sailed. Warner Bros. Heard the new Muse album, Absolution, moved them to Maverick, and was making arrangements to release the album through a different subsidiary. To this date, it had sold more than 3.5 million copies worldwide. The band follow-up, Black Holes and Revelations, has been sold more than 5 million. Now, to be fair, from a business standpoint, I did so many things wrong here. First, I should have gone directly to the guy about releasing Muse from his label. We were old friends, and we might have been able to work something out far less onerous than the $500,000. Maverick was at $500,000 Maverick was asking for. Second, when Sony balked at paying that money, I should have found it somewhere. Oh my god, I can't read. I should have found it somewhere else or put it up myself. Third, as annoyed as I was at my lawyer for not letting me know that the album had been delivered, I should have been calling in to check on it. I was way too zen about the whole deal. My spiritual practice seemed to be teaching me to believe that if it's meant to be, it will be. I wasn't going to force anything, but that's not really the way the music business works. All that said, ultimately I came away from this pretty annoyed with Sony. For a record company that I made a hell a lot of money for, and to not only be willing to invest in my vision, but to actively undermine, it was galling. The fact that their machinations ended up scuttling what would have been an extremely lucrative deal for both my company and theirs is even more so. When it came to start working on new material for System of a Down in late 2003, my head and heart weren't fully in it. At the time we started writing, my relationship with my ex-girlfriend had completely cratered. I was grieving that loss. I had been so deeply in love with her and thought this relationship was going to be for keeps. When it turned out that it wasn't, I sank into a deep depression. I lost a lot of weight and didn't want to leave the house much. In some ways, I had welcomed the idea of going to rehearsal space with Darren, Chavo, and John because it gave me something to do than other other than sitting around stewing about the demise of this relationship. The practice space didn't turn out to be, oh god, the practice space didn't turn out to be the haven I'd hoped it would be. Having worked with other musicians in the interim, I'd seen other ways of making music than the way we'd done it in System. I was writing songs and I was desperate to collaborate, to be creative, but everything in the band felt rigid and inflexible. No one wanted to change anything or even experiment with it. As we started to work out of our North Hollywood practice space, most of the songs that we had spent time were the ones that Darren had written. The music I had brought was shuffled to the side. If I mentioned I had a song that I wanted us to take a crack at, Darren would never outright refuse, but it was always, let's work on that one next week, or how about we finish up this batch of songs first. We rarely ever seemed to get to my songs. I found this all extremely frustrating and discouraging, but I really wasn't in the emotional headspace to put a fight up about it. Instead, I thought about the things I learned through meditation. I didn't want to get so tied up in what's mine and what's not mine, so I took a deep breath, literally and figuratively, and just let it go. This might have alleviated the tension in the moment, but it didn't make me any happier or more content in the long run. After a few weeks at a band meeting with Rick and Bino, I had told everyone that we had finished the album cycle, recording, promoting, and touring. After we had finished this, I was going to take some time away from the band. I wanted to work on my own music. I wanted the machine to stop so I can focus on being an artist again rather than a musician married to a fixed schedule on the road in service of commercial ends. I wasn't quitting the band forever, but I assured them it was going to be an indefinite hiatus. In the moment, everyone seemed to understand. They knew I'd really been struggling since the breakup with my ex and hadn't really been happy working on the music. I don't think anyone was surprised by my announcement, but I'm sure they had all assumed once that I had some time in breathing room, I'd change my mind. Maybe deep down I thought the same thing. In the short term, I hoped that making it clear how unhappy I was in the band, that Darren might be more willing to cede some of creative control, allow a more egalitarian ethos to take hold. Whatever, I can't read certain words, I'm sorry, guys. I thought that he might reflect on what was making me so miserable and try to alleviate it. In fact, the opposite was true. It seemed to me that Darren felt the band was falling apart, so he gripped the reins even more tightly to bring it under control. I sensed that happening, and I was totally disengaged, and I was physically present at the sessions, but not spiritually. It would be easy to blame Darren for all of this, but honestly, he was just being the person he had always been. For me to expect something else was naive. If I wanted to make a change in the way the band had operated, I had to be the engine of the change. I had to be proactive. Unfortunately, I couldn't see it then. My spiritual practice was actually making me more passive. I wanted to avoid stress, not to be in constant conflict with Darren or anyone else, to not hold on so tightly to things like status and ownership. I was also insecure about some of the songs I'd written. I felt like if I could let that stuff go, the embodiment of the Buddhist ideal, material possessions weighed us down, and that attachment to worldly things and this root of our suffering, that I'd be more at peace. None of those principles are necessarily wrong, but my interpretation of them back then were severely flawed. I simply figured that avoiding confrontation and conflict was more involved than engaging with it. I need to take a drink of water, sorry guys. I need to fill up my water bottle as well. Okay. While it did mean that I wasn't spending all the time in our practice space or in the studio clashing with my bandmates, I was pushing my problems to the side more than I was actually dealing with them. Those recording sessions were both interesting and strange. We were working with Rick again, this time at his manor, or Laurel Canyon Boulevard. It was across the street from Harry Houdini's old house, and the rumor that there was an underground tunnel connecting it to the Houdini mansion. If his place on Miller Drive was a bit spooky, this place felt downright haunted. At night, it groaned and creaked, doors would slam shut randomly, you'd hear sounds from rooms that no one was in. Other bands who'd worked with Rick there, like Red Hot Chili Peppers and Slipknot, had reported similarly bizarre experiences. Darren was also singing lead on a lot more songs than he had in the past. That didn't really bother me because I felt like if he had written the lyrics and the song suited his voice, he should sing it. I wanted the band to be a living, breathing organism that would just evolve and change as we all evolved and changed as artists. Just because I had been the lead singer in the past doesn't mean I had to be in the future. Just because fans were used to a certain version of System of a Down didn't mean we had to keep being that. There were times when I thought that Darren's voice didn't work well with the music, sure, but I didn't want to step on his toes. I felt that if I gave him the room to grow as an artist, he would eventually do the same for me, but it didn't work out that way. Jeez, hold on. Despite all the issues, the sessions were incredibly productive, at least in terms of the sheer quantity of the music we churned out. We once again recorded a plethora of songs, and some of them were great. Holy Mountains is a powerful anthem about the genocide and a sort of companion piece to Pluck. Sorry, I saw the chat. I didn't realize people were talking. Yes, I got 50 subs. Congratulations. I love this idea. Consider reading more slowly. Cool. Lost in Hollywood and Soldier Side are two of the best songs Darren has ever written. The former is simply a story about how being chewed up and spit out by the entertainment industry, but it's executed so beautifully. As for Soldier Side, it's an incredibly emotional anti-war song written from the standpoint of soldiers and their parents. To this day, I have a hard time singing those harmonies with Darren without getting choked up. BYOB is another anti-war song. I wrote the verses, which are angry, political, free associative poetry, and then Darren wrote the lyrics for the chorus, which are lighthearted jaunts about partying. How many songs can you think of that have references to Fort Knox, oil, fascism, and government corruption, all centered around the chorus about dancing in the desert / blowing up the sunshine? On one level, I suppose you could see that I can't read these words. As indicative of the ways in which Darren and I weren't on the same page at those sessions. In fact, though, his lighthearted chorus is exactly what the song needed. Much like our earlier collaborations, these parts really worked off each other. One deadly serious, the other completely unserious, and the contrast made the song super sharp. And the contrast makes the song sharper and more surprising. It was always what we'd done best. One of the songs of mine we recorded during those sessions was Question. I had written the song on an acoustic guitar in my living room. At the time, I lived in a beautifully serene 2-story nestled among trees in a cozy little community not far from Malibu. The verses were in a strange time signature, one that immediately put me into a kind of trance while playing and singing them. The pre-chorus switched from a straightforward 4/4 time opening room for a huge anthemic chorus where I sing, do we know when we fly, when we go, do we die? It had felt like there was a real profundity. God, I can't read these words. Holy crap. It felt like there was a real profundity and depth to the song. It was serious. I had brought Question in relatively early in the process, and I think the song caught Darren off guard. He had a habit of bringing his B-level material into our sessions first before building up into his stronger songs. I'm not sure why, but maybe he wanted to lower expectations so he could exceed them later. At any rate, I think Question forced him to bring his game up right away. Early in System's existence, Darren had convinced me that it wouldn't be fair to divide our publishing royalties into 4 equal shares since he and I were doing the vast majority of the songwriting. That seemed reasonable back then, and it was in my financial best interest to agree with him anyway. Instead, I devised a formula for figuring out the publishing shares on each song, which, according to my business manager, was a nice scientific way of breaking it down. If you contributed to the music to a verse, chorus, or bridge, you got a certain percentage. Ditto for the lyrics. It all worked out on a spreadsheet, though all big band decisions were decided by a vote of all 4 members, in this case, the publishing splits. Since Darren and I were the primary writers, normally the 2 of us would simply hash it out and decide what was equitable. On Question in particular, I had written both the music and the lyrics, and Darren had just contributed a little guitar tagline, which, if I'm being charitable, was worth about 5 to 10% of the publishing. But when it came to divvy it up, he received 20%. It seemed far-reaching, especially since I was only getting 5 to 10% on most of the songs in that album. It's not as if Darren forced this on me, but again, I got zen about it and decided it was a fight not worth fighting. I let him have it. This was a pattern that repeated itself on several occasions from on of the songs from these sessions. Whatever the creative conflict was, my answer was almost always what the fuck? My answer was almost always passivity. Oh my god. Um at the end of the recording, we once again had multiple albums worth of material. When it came to figure out which songs would make the final cut, I'd leaned on the lesson we learned about the last go around. I suggested that we divide the songs into two albums and release both. Part of me knew this was my last hurrah with the band, at least for a while, so it seemed to make sense to get the most mileage we could. I had no intention to tour between two separate albums, but I figured if they were released closely enough together, we could do one big run. We'd just do one big run up of shows to support them both. Initially, this suggestion was not much more popular than my suggestion to release Still This Album had been. But once everyone in the band, the management, the label, had realized that it might be a long time before they got anything else out of system, they came around. We put out Mesmerize in May 2005, and its companion Hypnotize dropped 6 months later. Looking back, that release scheme looks more like a marketing masterstroke. We became one of the very few artists to ever hit number 1 on the Billboard charts with 2 different albums on the same year. It was a huge commercial triumph for the band, albeit one that I had a hard time getting very excited about. In many ways, despite having some great music on them, those albums felt like a personal matter to me. When I listened to them, even now, it reminded me of all the heartache I had when we began making them, all the concessions I had made along the way, and the spiritual confusion that let it all happen. Chapter 13. Our documentaries are a dime a dozen. It's a proven formula. Send an ambitious young filmmaker out on the road with a band, gather some flattering performance footage, clips of screaming fans, and bits of the band clowning around backstage or on the tour bus, then edit it all together, and you got a perfectly serviceable promotion item to stroke interest in the band's upcoming album. There's nothing wrong with these films, but I wouldn't be excited to make one. Unfortunately, when Carla Gardapedian came to me in 2004 wanting to make a documentary with System of a Down, I hate reading so much, this is why I'm doing this. This sort of self-serving fluff was not what she had in mind. Carla was a former BBC journalist who had already made these films about homeless orphans in North Korea and had the plight of women in Taliban-dominated Afghanistan. Now she wanted to make a film about the Armenian genocide. As we began to talk, it occurred to me that we had a chance to do something really subversive, under the guise of typical hagiographic documentary. We could slip in a hard-hitting album film about genocide denial and its effects. I convinced the rest of the guys to let Carla and her small crew trail us around off and on for the next 6 months or so, on tour, at home, wherever. She filmed it with my grandfather's step-aunt, who was then living in a nursing home, and used older footage of him talking about his personal experiences living through the genocide. She had also filmed our Third Souls show at the Universal Amphitheater in Los Angeles and interviewed fans outside the show. When we were on tour in Chicago, we realized that we were only a few miles from the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hasterd's local office. Hastert had made himself a chief impediment to local recognition of the genocide by the U.S. government. In 2000, he'd withdrawn a resolution from the House floor that would formally recognize the genocide, even though the Internal Relations Committee had forwarded out of committee for a vote by the full House. He insisted that it was an appeal from President Clinton, claiming that the bill would damage U.S.-Turkey's relations and caused him to withdraw it before a final vote. In later years, there were substantial allegations that Turkish diplomats and intelligence officers had paid Hastert $500,000 to pull the resolution from the House floor, threatening to expose evidence of the child molestation that he eventually went to jail for if he didn't. Though Hastert had never faced charges related to the bribery or blackmail, the fact that he became a lobbyist for the Turkish government following his time in Congress didn't exactly quiet those concerns. In the fall of 2005, we were in Chicago. The Relations Committee had once again forwarded a bill on genocide recognition, and Hazard was once again the man holding the power to kill it or put it to a full vote. In 24 hours, we arranged a rally outside his office. John and I both went to help lead the protest, give interviews to the media, and deliver to Hasser a petition and a letter I'd written about my grandfather's experience during the genocide. He either wasn't there or wouldn't see us, so I left the material with his staff. That night we had a show at what was then called the Rosemont Horizon at an arena near the Chicago airport. My security guy had told me that he had gotten a message from friends at the FBI letting him know that Turkish intelligence was tracking me and my movements. These were vague threats. Apparently, the noise I had been making about the genocide recognition and the news coverage of the ad hoc protest was at Hazard's office had gotten their attention, and not in a good way. Logically speaking, I knew that it was incredibly unlikely that the Turks were going to hire an assassin to take out the lead singer of a popular rock band on American soil. Logic, though, has a possible way of being unsettled by fear. Your mind keeps drawing to the worst possible conclusions. The Turks viewed genocide recognition as an existential threat to their state, and as one of the most visible proponents of this recognition campaign, what wouldn't they do to shut me up? I can remember feeling very jittery on stage that night, and for most of the rest of the show, and for most of the rest of that tour, I'm sure if you were to watch a video of those shows, you notice that I'm moving around a lot more than usual, darting around in sudden, unpredictable directions, as ridiculous as it sounds. Darting in sudden, unpredictable directions. As ridiculous as it sounds, somewhere in my brain, my thought was, if some sharpshooter wants to take a crack at me, I'm not going to make myself an easy target. Still, I wasn't going to let threats change my course. A few months after visiting Hazard's office in Illinois, we went to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of the Congress about the resolution, which was languishing in limbo. The meetings were arranged by the Armenian National Committee of America. I was under no illusions. I knew that I was getting access to the halls of power in return for lending whatever celebrity I had to the cause. Some of the youngest members of the Congress were actually System of a Down fans and wanted to meet me. Other older ones wanted a photo for their kids or grandkids. It was kind of a sketchy trade-off, but I wasn't about to waste the opportunity to buttonhole people who were in a position to help. Excuse me. A few of the House members I had met, Democrats like Adam Schiff and Frank Pallone, were already big supporters of the Armenian community and genocide recognition. Although I certainly identify to the left side of the political spectrum, the recognition campaign doesn't necessarily align with one political party or another, and I was willing to cross the aisle to win support. Devin Nunes was then a Republican congressman representing a district in central California with a big Armenian population. He didn't seem particularly engaged with the situation, but knew it was important to the people who would vote for him, so he was all for the resolution. Nunes introduced me to another Republican congressman and had told me that this particular congressman was a huge music fan. I can't recall this guy's name, but he was an interesting study in contrast. Unlike a lot of the other congressmen I met, this guy was whip-smart and politically astute. But his conservative political views didn't seem to match up at all with his musical taste. He had a poster of John Lennon in his office and told me he was a big fan of the radical left-wing proto-punk band MC5. I knew MC5 founder Wayne Kramer through his work of the Axis of Justice and arranged for Wayne to send him some cool merch. On the issue of this chapter is so... I don't know if I can read this chapter out loud, really. Hold on. Alright, whatever. I'm just gonna... At one point, I sat beside Eric Cantor, who was then a part of the Republicans' majority House leadership, along with a table full of his constituents. all of whom were speaking passionately about the importance of formal recognition. He nodded in agreement and muttered things like, yes, it should be recognized, but remained noncommittal in terms of any real action. Finally, I looked over at him and said sharply, so you're going to pressure the speakers to bring this to a full vote? He looked annoyed and gave me another wrong non-answer. Ultimately, the resolution had been more than enough to support wind passage. It just came down to whether Hazard would schedule a vote on it. He still wouldn't meet with me, but by chance I saw him in the Capitol Rotunda talking to some sort of youth group in matching shirts. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to corner him, but did it very politely. With Carla's documentary crew in tow, I introduced myself and asked if he had a chance to read the letter I had delivered to his office. He claimed he had not seen it yet. I explained to him that everyone I'd met with that day in Congress agreed the genocide was a historical fact, that the fate of this bill, which was so important to our community, was entirely in his hands. He smiled, shook my hand, and promised, I'll take a look at your letter. Then he walked away. Brushing so closely to the country's levers of power that brings with it an undeniable charge, a little endorphin rush. But once that had passed, it was hard not to come away from that day on Capitol Hill feeling incredibly discouraged with how democracy works. Here was a truth nobody was disputing, a bill most everyone agreed with on its merits, but it still could be scuttled because one guy who may or may not have bribed and blackmailed by who had not been bribed and blackmailed by Turkey, had the power to do so. Is that really the way a democratic republic was meant to function? Within the music industry, there were definite mechanisms that created a sort of political favoritism as well. Certain causes and ideas got noticed and supported, others did not. In 2006, I fell into a situation that allowed me to see those gears turning up close, and it was not pretty. I was in New York to meet with Craig Kallman, the CEO of Atlantic Records, at the label's office. I went there with this amazing progressive rock band called Fair to Midland, who I had signed to Surgical Strike. They had a little buzz behind them, and were looking for a major label to partner with to release their album. It was down to Atlantic or Universal, and both companies were anxious to make it a deal. I like Craig a lot, and the meeting went well. When it was over, we walked out of the conference room and he pulled me aside. Hey, do you want to meet the old man? He asked. What old man? Ahmet, he clarified. His office is right next door. Ahmet Ertegun was a music industry legend. As a Turkish immigrant, he'd founded Atlantic back in the 1940s, then helped launch the careers of icons like John Coltrane, Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and the Bee Gees and Led Zeppelin, among many others. By this time, he was in his early 80s and had more of a ceremonial position at Atlantic, but I imagine his stature was helpful for closing deals. Regardless, I had a lot of reverence for his legacy and was excited to meet him. I was ushered into his office, a plush cavern of dark woods and leather furniture that looked like something out of the 1970s. Ahmet was sitting beside a big brown desk and introduced himself. We made some small talk, and I told him it was an honor to talk to him. It was all very cordial and inconsequential, until I mentioned to him that I was Armenian. He stiffened a little, and something in the air changed. The first person I hired at the company was Armenian, he told me, a little defensively. That's great. That's great, I said. I brought up my friend Arto and wondered if Ahmet might know Arto's brother, I don't know how to say that. Who was a very famous songwriter in Turkey. He did, but the conversation continued to feel stilted. After a few more minutes of chit-chat about musicians in Armenia, I thanked him for his time and left. Excuse me. Later that day, I was flying back to LA, and something about that short meeting continued to gnaw at me. I opened my laptop and plugged Ahmet's name into Google alongside the word genocide. It was then that I finally understood why he'd gotten so uncomfortable when he found out I was Armenian. Ahmet had a history of funding organizations and university chairs that traffic genocide and genocide denial. His family had a deep history in this area. Ahmet's father had been a close advisor to Kemal the founder of the modern Turkish Republic. Later, the Turkish ambassador to the U.S. Later, as the Turkish ambassador to the U.S., his father had fiercely fought against the making of film adaptations, the 40 Days of Musadah, a popular novel set in during the Armenian genocide. As recent as 1998, Ahmet had acknowledged the Armenian deaths that had taken place in 1915, but he maintained that they were not a part of the extermination campaign, claiming that they were different interpretations of what happened. Learning all this created a conundrum for me. How could I have potentially worked with a company whose founder and figurehead was a genocide denier? But it was right to tell the guys in Fair Midland who were not Armenian that they couldn't make a deal with Atlantic because of a 90-year-old grievance. What was my duty to them as a business partner, if you will, versus my duty to the Armenian cause? For the moment, I kept it all to myself and marinated on it. Craig called me a few weeks later to take my temperature on the deal. I told him the band hadn't made a decision yet, which was true. I had always respected Craig, so I decided to level with him. "There's a thing I want to mention with you," I said at last. "It's about the old man." "What about the old man?" I told him about my meeting with Ahmet then my later discovery of his history of denying the Armenian genocide. Craig was shocked and knew nothing about it. "Let me look into this and get back to you," he assured me. A few days later, I was out walking my dogs in the rain when my cell phone rang. It was Ahmet. He was anxious to talk and try to smooth things over. When I pointed out his blatant support to the four so-called scholars that denied the genocide at chairs he had endowed at various universities or think tanks he had sponsored, recommended that the U.S. government not recognize the genocide. He said the scholars are no longer there. He believed that the genocide occurred and that Turkey should recognize properly of it, but if I'm being honest, I was skeptical of the ardor of his belief. After all, he was close with the top officials of the Turkish government, including Recep Tayyip, I can't pronounce a lot of these names, who was then the prime minister, including and later became the country's autocratic president. "You have to understand, this isn't just activism for me," I explained. "This is personal. My grandparents lived through the genocide. I have spent most of my life advocating for this cause. If I go into business with you, that will make me look like a hypocrite." "No," he said. "It's not like that. We can work this out." I suggested a solution. "How about if you write a letter on Atlantic Records letterhead that says, 'I'm a last name, recognize the Armenian genocide, sign it and send it to me. I will never publicize the letter unless it's my back against the wall with my own people. I can keep it quiet." "I can't do that," he told me. "Why not? You just said you recognize the genocide. Why can't you put it on paper?" "Because if anyone discovers that letter, they will burn my house down in Turkey. He said. "I would be in serious danger." I thought about it. Putting this old man in peril didn't seem like a good solution to this quandary. "Look, I don't want anything bad to happen to you," I said at last. "Don't worry about it. Give me a little time and let me see if there's something else that I can do," he told me. We left it at that. A week later, Craig had called me and was blunt. "If you're waiting for the old man to do something, he's not going to," he said. I could tell he was upset about the whole situation, but there was nothing he could do. The guys in Fair to Midland had eventually decided to make a deal with Universal instead of Atlantic, anyway. I didn't nudge them in any way or let them know anything about this whole subplot after they made up their minds. Their decision had nothing to do with it. Nonetheless, on some level, it had felt like karmic justice. There has to be a cause for the genocide denial, and even if the only real cost I personally exacted was making Ahmet uncomfortable and forcing him to answer for his support of the genocide denial, that was not nothing. This is one of the most powerful and beloved figures in the music industry history. To know that he was not able to live his life without paying a price for the serious ethical failings makes it easier for me to believe that there's a spiritual balance in the world. As Martin Luther King Jr. once put it, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." In a small way, I could feel that bend. Not too long after all this went down, Ahmet died after tripping backstage at a Rolling Stone show. Shortly after his death, Haru Sasunian, an Armenian journalist, published a story in which he wrote that Ahmet reached out to him a few years earlier to disavow his previous genocide denial. Ahmet told Sassunan the same thing he had told me, that he couldn't go public with it because it would make him a target for Turkish extremists. So Sassunan, Sassunyan had Sassunayan, sorry, had waited until his death to reveal it. I'm not sure if it makes me happy to know that Amit was apparently genuine in what he had told me that day on the phone and wasn't just trying to close the ordeal, or if it makes me sad that it felt like it wasn't a safe place to speak the truth. Maybe a little of both. Around this time, Carla was shopping for a distributor for the documentary that she had made with us, which was titled Screamers. The film had turned out to be an amazing piece of stealth political activism. Yes, yes, it has many of the things you'd find in a normal tour documentary. System rocking out on stage, declaration of love from fans, behind-the-scenes footage from the tour bus. But it's all wrapped around brutal images of genocide throughout the past century, in interviews with diplomats, journalists, experts, and survivors explaining how the denial of the Armenian genocide opened the door all to the rest. Because System was such a big part of the documentary, Carla was talking a lot of record companies about distributing the film. I was helping out wherever I could. Carla told me that Lior Cohen, who was the CEO of Warner Music Group, had vetoed his company distributing the film out of loyalty to Amit, whom he had considered a great friend and mentor. This really upset me. Amit's father had successfully quashed one film about the genocide decades earlier. And now here he was, I can't read. Now, here he was. Now here was his son doing the same thing from beyond the grave. What was even more upsetting is that Amit had insisted at least me and Harut Sassunayan had believed that Turkey should recognize the genocide. So how was Lior handling this factor, his friend's legacy, by standing in the way of a film advocating for that? This was a pivotal time during my career, as I was getting ready to sign a solo deal with Warner Brothers Records, a division of Warner Music Group that Lior headed, In light of all this, I made sure to insert my clause into my contract with Warner's to prevent them from impeding my political activism. Tom Whaley, who was the president of Warner Bros. Records, who also involuntarily put in the middle of the Screamers issue, was aforementioned Craig Tallman. God, I feel like I'm mumbling. And though I loved Warner, I made it clear to Tom in the same way that I had to Craig. This was a very real issue that caused me serious discomfort. Genocide denial simply cannot be shrugged off. When I got on the phone with Lior, I explained all of this, recounting both my family's history and my conversation with Amit. As an Israeli Jew, I told him, surely he would understand the importance of acknowledging genocide. Lior took it all in, and to his credit, he did understand. I made that decision, and I'm sorry. He acknowledged, I'm happy to purchase the film. Look, I'm not actually on the phone trying to sell you the film, as it looks like Sony's gonna pick it up, I said. I just wanted to let you know why this was an issue for me. Carla ended up going with Columbia, a division of Sony, to distribute Screamers. It was always her film, not mine, but the band's success had put me into a position where I had some leverage with decision makers. So if I wasn't going to use that leverage to question the decisions they were making, what was it all for? About 6 months after Screamer was released, I was in New Zealand on the treadmill one afternoon and at the gym, half watching CNN as I jogged, when I suddenly recognized a face on the screen. It was named H. Dink, a Turkish-Armenian journalist and activist who had been prominently featured in Screamers. H. had lived and worked in Turkey, where he eloquently and courageously advocated not only for the genocide recognition by the Turkish government, but also for reconciliation between Turks and Armenians, who had lived side by side for hundreds of years. He had just been assassinated in front of the newspapers and offices in Istanbul. I stepped off the treadmill in complete shock. I had met H at Screamers premiere, and we really connected. He had been arrested multiple times for speaking out against the genocide, for speaking out about the genocide, and had faced threats before, but he was soft-spoken and gracious, less a bomb-throwing revolutionary than a diplomatic man of principle. I considered him a friend, and now he was dead. The killer was a 17-year-old Turkish nationalist who, after shooting had, I don't know, 3 times at point-blank range, smiled for photos with Turkish police officers who were supposed to be arresting him. As I stood there in that empty gym, looking at the TV, then staring out of the large glass window with tears running down my face, I felt scared and angry, like I almost needed to take cover. I thought back to the threats I personally received when I was on tour. Maybe I wasn't being an alarmist after all. I felt like they were all coming for all of us. I mean, what won't they do to shut us up? While I was excited to have Carla along the documenting parts of our tour, being back out on the road after a couple years had only sporadic shows that quickly reminded me why I didn't like the touring life. We did almost 100 shows in 2005, with long treks through Europe, North America, and Australia and New Zealand. And it was exhausting. For one stretch of our US tour, I'm pretty sure our bus driver was on crack. He'd regularly wake us up yelling to himself while he was driving, shouting things like, "I'm gonna get you, I'm coming for you." At one point, the bus slid into a ditch on a snowy road. At another, it broke down completely, and he just went outside and started kicking it. Trucker crack is apparently a hell of a drug. As challenging as it could be, touring life had never been all that bad. John and I would always go out for restaurants together on the road. Shava would join us sometimes. Through ordering food with Shava required a level of patience and only practice in high-level yoga. On stage, Darren would always crack us up with funny voices and other antics when he first sang a romantic version of our song Cigarro. And he tweaked the lyrics and sang, this. When Chavo and I had heard it on stage, we were both practically on the floor laughing. At our best moments, system gigs would be half performance, half inside jokes. Some of the shows on these tours were genuinely great, but no matter how good they could be for me, the highs of being on stage and performing didn't seem to balance out all the lows that it took to get there. At a festival in Spain, high winds blew the roof off of our outdoor stage and had forced the promoters to postpone our set. They wanted to cancel, but apparently some of the 30,000 people in attendance had already started setting shit on fire and destroying the stuff at the news of the mere delay of the show. The promoters were afraid of what they might do if the concert was canceled outright, so we waited backstage for hours, hoping the wind would subside enough that we could play. It never really did, but after backstage area ran out of food and water, we finally took the stage around 3:45 a.m. The wind was still whipping around, and I was getting mouthfuls of sand and debris as I tried to sing. It felt practically apocalyptic. As we finally finished our set around 5 a.m., The Prodigy, who had a massive hit several years later with the frenetic and hopefully tongue-in-cheek electronic music blitzkrieg's smack my bitch up, had still had to play after us. I remember walking off the stage and seeing poor Keith Flint, the group's normally maniac orange-haired frontman, was walking towards the stage with a dead-eyed look on his face. I walked and just shrugged. I nodded and just shrugged. Sorry, bro. He shook his head and kept walking. In some ways, although nights like that weren't particularly enjoyable while they were happening, they did at least serve to break up the monotonous blur of touring. The rest of the guys seemed to have coped better with life on the road than I did. I think Darren and Chavo and John had all dreamed of living this life. They've grown up desperate to be rock stars, and now they were doing it. I was never interested in that part of it. I wanted to be an artist. I'm not saying that the rest of the guys didn't care about music or art. They did. But they understood everything that came with being a successful and were fully on board with it. For me, System was becoming a day job so I could continue to be an artist. When the tour had finally ended in October, I was relieved. By then I had started dating Angela, who I'd met the night before our Souls show in 2004. I'd finally gotten her number from a mutual friend and called her, and everything in that relationship was still sparkling and new. The two of us had even planned to take a trip to Armenia so I could meet her father and grandparents. They were from Vanadzor, a city about 2 hours north from the capital, nestled in the mountains. Angela's father was a giant man with a portly laugh who was a connoisseur of all good things in the area. Her grandfather was the real family patron, an engineer by trade who had run the largest construction company in Armenia for years. Her paternal grandmother was an English teacher, which explained why Angie's English was fluent from day one despite her not having lived in the US for that long. Unlike my first trip to Armenia 5 years earlier, now people in the street often recognize me. I had really long curly hair then, which was unusual from the men in the country at the time. When I was recognized, I get approached by well-wishers and autograph seekers. When I wasn't, I get approached by people who were laughing at my long hair and making fun of me. Either way, I thought it was good to see people smile in a country that had dealt with so much hardship over the last decade. I'm gonna move my phone a little bit. Hey, stop that. So I can lay down properly. Show you well. Tonight I wanna show you well. While we were in Armenia, I met with Vartan Oskanian, who was the foreign minister at the time. A friend of mine worked for him, and we had arranged the meeting. It was enlightening. We spoke about Armenia's challenges of the moment in time. There was an influx of money, people, and energy in the capital, Yerevan, Yerevan, but the same vibrancy wasn't being felt on the countryside. Villages and towns were experienced serious depopulation due to the lack of investment and infrastructure and employment. The early years of Armenian independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union had been difficult. The 1988 Spitak earthquake, the first 1988 Spitak earthquake, the first Nagorno, oh my god, I can't say any of these, I feel horrible. War and the complete de-evaluation of the rebel had plunged newly independent Armenia into the cold of winter. The infrastructure erected by more recent Soviet reigns crumbled quickly because of their hierarchical corruption embedded in the late-era Soviet system. Contractors took payoffs to look the other way. When the well-connected stole cement and other building material, doctors had often obtained their medical license with well-placed bribes, and as a result, their whole healthcare system was in shambles. You never knew if the doctor you were going to actually had gone to medical school or just paid for a certificate to hang on the wall. Ditto for educators, engineers, and those in many other sectors of professional society. All post-Soviet states were mirrored in this same cacophony of corruption. Modernization was slow in many reigns of Armenia. Angie told me about how growing up she'd go to school in the winter in full snow gear, but only because the heat had came from wood-burning stoves from which students would have to chop up wood. Electricity was intermittent at best, and she was often reading by candlelight in the evenings. I had long felt a deep spiritual connection to Armenia and its history through my family, but this trip felt like a beginning of building a relationship with the country as a contemporary entity. The longer I was there, the less I felt like a tourist, and the more I felt like a part of it. I have to put my hair down. Ow. I need to really expand my vocabulary. Wow, you guys are so boring. None of you guys like reading for old children? Sorry, I'm typing something if anyone's watching. finally put it's too long to type 2 words. Where was I? Okay. A few months earlier, back at the North American leg of the Mesmerize tour, we played 2 shows back-to-back in Quebec City. I managed to find enough time during those 2 shows to go on a short hike. While on the hike, I got an email from our management that mentioned the possibility of the band playing some shows in 2006. Eager to stay focused on the nature around me, I responded with something along the lines of, "Sounds good, we'll talk about it later." Something along the lines of, "Sounds good, we'll talk about it later." I had already told Bino and the whole band about the current touring wrapped up, after the current touring wrapped up, I'd be taking, hold on, I'd already told Bino and the whole band after that current tour, my fucking god, I can't read. I'd already told Bino and the whole band that after the current touring wrapped up, I'd be taking time away from the band, so I'm not sure why it wasn't more declarative about it in the response to the particular message. Frankly, I just didn't think about it that much. I figured that management was presenting options for us to consider for the following year, and I didn't want to think about it right then while I was hiking. When I was finally back home in Los Angeles after the Armenia trip, the issue was raised again, and this time I was more definitive. I needed the time away and had no interest in touring next year. The rest of the band didn't take this very well. Touring was undoubtedly ludicrous, but at the time, my time and peace of mind were worth more to me than any paycheck. It's not like Darren, Shavo, and John didn't have a reasonable argument. We hadn't done a tour to support the release of Hypnotize, so it wouldn't make sense business-wise. We do a run of Ozfest dates, at least. Oh my god, so it wouldn't make sense business-wise to do a run of Ozfest dates, at least. The thing is, I wasn't arguing about whether or not it had made business sense. I personally was so over it. I was completely burned out on the band and touring, and I'd only survived the 80-plus shows that we did that year because I knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I had already told my band the band about my plans for a hiatus we had done. When we'd first started working on Mesmerize and Hypnotize 2 years earlier, so it's not like as if I was dropping out on this. Hold on. So it's not as if I was dropping this on them out of left field. This argument was simmering within the band as we rehearsed for a couple one-off shows we had agreed to do at the end of 2005. One in NTV in New York and the other KROQ's acoustic Christmas concert in LA. On break from what were definitely tense rehearsal sessions, Darren was riding in the passenger seat of my car as I drove. And when he revealed that Shava was thinking about suing me if I didn't agree to do Ozfest the next summer, I was so stunned that I almost had to pull the car over. As Darren explained it, Shava's view was that when I responded to the management of initial inquiry about next year's shows, "Sounds good, let's talk about it later," was a binding contract. Darren didn't come out and say that he was going to join this lawsuit, but he didn't say that he wasn't going to, instead muttering something along the lines of, "We'll do what we gotta do." John, for his part, made it clear that he'd never sue me. I felt completely violated. For whatever creative friction and personality conflicts existed within the band, I still considered all the guys to be more than just my friends, something closer to family. We'd been through so much together and created something incredibly special, which had transformed all of our lives. This felt like sacred trust we built was being destroyed in the worst way. They knew how scarred I'd been by the lawsuit, and that financially wrecked my family, to now be potentially facing the same thing from people that I thought of as brothers was like being stabbed in the back. It was traumatic. I honestly would rather Shava had punched me in the face. Oh my god. I honestly would have rather had Shavo punched me in the face. And to think it was done for as a paycheck was even worse. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have ever taken the lawsuit that seriously, but thinking about what damage can be done by one, I hired lawyers to help evaluate whether this threat was real. I spent several $1,000s on legal fees and was advised to find an amicable situation. In the end, I signed a agreement promising to do the Ozfest dates in return for the collective liability dissolution, aka nobody suing me. It was both ridiculous and tragic, and it felt like something in the band broke that day, perhaps irretrievably. Meanwhile, we still had to play that KROQ acoustic Christmas show. It was probably the least enjoyable gig of my life. I had broke down crying before we had even went on, then trashed my keyboard on stage out of sheer rage. My passion had become my passion had become my career, and now I felt like my career was choking the life out of me. By the time we went out onto Ozfest the following summer, I was more in control of my I was more in control of my emotions, but no happier to be there. I tried to put on good shows each night after all, or I tried to put on good shows each night. After all, why would fans who shelled out their hard-earning money just to get shafted who couldn't get along? To get shafted just because we couldn't get along. But I spent a lot of my downtime on my own bus, writing and recording material for Elect the Dead, my first solo album. In many ways, the shows themselves were fine, the crowds were great, and the band was as popular as it had ever been, and we'd been playing together for so long that we were a well-oiled machine. But emotionally, I was totally checked out. A lot of the people who'd gotten my ear then shortly or thereafter asked me why I had to leave a band at the absolute height of its popularity. While it may not have been the shrewdest business decision, that was never my motivation for playing in this band. I could see that my path was diverging me from the band, and I simply had to follow wherever it was going to take me. The decision was financially suspect, but spiritually unsound. In many ways, it was no different than ditching the ultimate solutions when it was highly profitable, but otherwise not very enriching for me. We played our last show of that Ozfest tour in an amphitheater in West Palm Beach, and I tried to appreciate the moment for what it was, knowing that it represented the end of an era for me, the closing of a door. I hadn't said that I was quitting the band forever, but we had said our goodbyes after the show. I knew things would never be the same again for the band, or would never be the same for the band ever again, and they weren't. Chapter 14. I'd read two chapters now. My teeth hurt. I've been reading for an hour? God, I'm a slow fucking reader. You guys are so boring. When I had started playing my Casio keyboard in college to take my mind off of what the mess my world had become, I couldn't have imagined the series of events that would have followed, which would lead me to one stage sitting at my home studio, playing music for an Oscar-winning director. But here I was in the late 2005, hanging out with William Friedkin, who had directed The French Connection and The Exorcist, among many other films, letting him listen to clips of the unreleased music I had recorded. There was a lot of it. I had been writing music pretty much every day for a number of years. I was building this vast library of songs and musical pieces, but with System of a Down, we were only going to put out 15 or 20 songs tops every few years. Much of this music would never fit into System anyway. It was closer in spirit to goth, jazz, or classical music, and even the stuff that could have fit in hardly ever did. I was experimenting with samples, prepared piano, ethnic instruments, strings, and programming beats. System songs were almost always started with guitars, but so much of the music I was making more piano-based. I had tracks upon tracks of music that I'd never done anything with. I wanted a way to get some of it out into the world, and had long been interested in composing music for films. A friend, Jay Fairs, who had ran the music division at Lionsgate, suggested that I meet with Friedkin. He was directing a psychological thriller for them called Bug. They already had. I need to take a drink of water. My mouth is so foamy right now. It's actually disgusting. Kindly for me, take them by their filthy nostrils, put them up in doggy hostels. Where was I? I ended up doing essentially what I ended up doing what were essentially a few character themes, music that would set the vibe when a certain character came on stream. It was my first foray into making music for films and TV, and I was hooked. Fredkin was great to work with and was a very generous guy. When System won a Grammy in 2006, he sent me a beautiful bouquet of flowers. There's something about the process of scoring that really appeals to me. A lot of the work is really in the conversation you would have with a director before you even play a note. What's the tone they're aiming for? What sort of emotional palette do they envision? What instruments do they hear? What instruments do they hear? Once you figure out the vibe, the actual music falls into place pretty easily. It's a different sort of creative puzzle to solve than writing songs for a band. I guess some artists might find all parameters limiting, but I find them liberating. The world of film music is almost completely separate from the one I had been working in with System. The fact that I fronted a multi-platinum rock band for a decade carried very little cachet with music supervisors and directors. No one really cared about that I commanded the attention of 50,000 people at the reading festival, or that I'd had hits on MTV. Maybe it would get me a meeting with the supervisor, but it wouldn't get me work. But it wouldn't get me work. Hold on, I have to. It's not coming out. I hate my life. My mouth is so sweet, it makes me sad. My poor mouth. I had to prove my worth all over again, and I loved that. It was a new challenge. I had to prove my work all over again, and I loved that. It was a new challenge. Not long after working on Bug, I was in one of those meetings at my studio with a major music supervisor named G. Mark Roswell, playing him music, talking about my enthusiasm for scoring when he interrupted me. Wait, I'm a little confused, he confessed. Why are you confused? Well, if you're interested in this kind of work, why did you say no to The Passion of the Christ, the controversial Mel Gibson directed film that it came out 2 years earlier and was nominated for an Oscar at the best original score. I think Mark could tell by the look on my face that I was now the one who was confused. I was helping put that together, and I wanted you to do some music for it. He continued. How? Huh. I was helping put that together and wanted you to do some music for it. He continued. The answer I got back is that you weren't interested. Huh? I stammered. I said what? I was told that you passed on it, he said. This is the first I've heard of it, I told him. Who did you talk to? Your agent, he replied. After Mark left, I tried to trace back what happened. I called my film agent at CAA, and he knew nothing about it. Then I tried my booking agent at William Morris, a guy named Don Muller. Don, I was just at a meeting with Mark Roswell about the film music, I said. Did you tell him I couldn't do Passion of the Christ? The phone line got quiet. Yeah, he admitted, barely above a whisper. Is this the right page? Yeah. Why? I asked. Why on earth would you tell him that? Again, silence. He just spoke in a single word. Bino. I hung up with Don and called my manager, David Bino what the fuck? I recounted the saga to him and simply asked, what happened? I don't remember, he said. You don't remember? I don't remember any conversations about that, he said, pointing out that it was a few years ago. He had lots of conversations about the band, and people asked us to do things all the time, and it didn't ring a bell. But this one didn't ring a bell. To this day, he insists he has no memory about ever being asked about me contributing music for The Passion of the Christ or turning it down. I wanted to give Bino the benefit of the doubt. He was a good manager who did a lot of things right and to help a not obvious commercial band achieve great commercial success. But it seemed to me there was some conflicts of interest with him managing me as a solo artist, in this case, the Passion of Christ opportunity. I had worked back on it. Oh my god, my head hurts. I had worked back on it around 2003 or 2004. That might have further distanced me from System at the time when I was already floating out of the band's orbit. With System being the big cash cow, my thought at the time was that Bino had vested financial interest in maintaining the status quo. I'm not saying he did, or that dropping the ball on this opportunity was somehow intentional, but it was hard to avoid wondering about it. That in itself was a problem. Within this mind, decided I needed a new team to work with. That I already had a record label in mind, Warner Bros. And now I got a new management team, Coldplay's manager Dave Holmes, along with my friend George, Tony, Tony Keon to help handle the day-to-day stuff, and started a new lawyer too. It felt like a clean slate, and I needed to in order to start marching forward confidently as a solo artist. If the latter days of System felt increasingly like a creative prison for me, making Elect the Dead was like finally being set free. I had all these songs. I had all these songs. Ones I'd originally written with hopes the band would record them. Ones I'd written on my tour bus on days during that final Ozfest run. Ones I was continuing to write each day. And now the only arbiter of whether they were worth recording for me. In 2006, I started working in my home studio, building tracks exactly the opposite way we used to do it in the band. This wasn't out of some stubborn determination to turn my artistic life on its head, it was out of pure necessity. I didn't have a band yet, so the usual method of laying down the drum tracks and then building the song around them wasn't going to work itself. Instead, I started with the acoustic guitar or piano and worked from there. I don't think I wrote a single song on electric guitar, which served to make the songs more melodic and harmonic. Once I had the acoustic guitar or piano down, I laid down rough vocals, so I know my melodies. Then I'd program drums to discover my rhythm. Usually it was that point that I'd started to add electric guitar, bass, keys, strings, and anything else. With a song like Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition, I used loops and samples to build the structural skeleton, then added various instruments. My motto throughout was no limits, no rules. Working mostly alone suited me. I had such a clear vision of what I wanted to do, what I wanted to accomplish I'm so horrible at reading. It makes me so mad because I feel like an idiot. I feel like I praise the Lord and I need to where's my wax? I need to put this in my mouth because it's really hurting me. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Life affirming. Come lay it down. Come burn it down. Lay it down above the ground. Alright, whatever. Whatever, man. Working mostly alone suited me. I had a clear vision of what I wanted to accomplish that hiring other people would have likely just gotten in the way. Eventually, I did bring Dan Monty, who had met on those Buckethead sessions, to play additional guitar and bass and helping me with engineering. I asked Brian Brain Mancia to play most of the live drums, except on a couple of hard-hitting punk rock tracks, for which I enlisted John. To his credit, despite what To his credit, despite what was happening with System, John was an enthusiastic participant and even tried to refuse payment on his work for the sessions. A version of the song started to come together. I invited a few other friends to give me feedback. My friend Jay brought along his 11-year-old nephew along to listen. Hold on. My friend Jay brought his 11-year-old nephew along to listen. Just observing this kid gave me the most honest, unfiltered sense in which songs were working best. Whereas adults will couch the reactions with diplomacy, kids don't have that sort of discretion. The songs he liked, he'd start headbanging his head and jumping around. The ones that didn't move him literally didn't move him. The album is a pretty good indication of where my head was at back then. The first single, Empty Walls, is about a lack of empathy people seem to have for victims of humanitarian catastrophes. God. The Unthinking Majority is a loud and thrash metal song that takes aim at dictators. I've been reading a lot about indigenous I hate my life. I wish I was indigenous cultures and the way they saw themselves existing in harmony with nature rather than trying to triumph over it. This was heavily impacting my own spiritual outlook and finding its way into songs like Haunting Antelope, Feed Us, and Sky Is Over. That was concerned with the environment and population. I wrote Saving Us on acoustic guitar while sitting with Angie. It's basically about the tumultuous first few years of our relationship. Aww. Money exercises some of my issues with System, and despite lyrics like self-absorbed delusion and inclusion of dysfunction, and the causes of servitude can be traced to a tyranny of a down. How's it go? How's the song go? I forgot how the song goes. How's the song go? Waiting patience. The causes of my servitude can be traced to the tyranny of a down. No one, including Darren, Chavo, and John, ever seemed to pick up on it, or if they did, they never mentioned it. Baby literally came to me in a dream. I can recall watching a hand play the chords on an acoustic guitar. I think it was actually Darren's hand and a voice singing to him. I think it was actually Darren's hand and a voice singing the words. I woke up and immediately picked up my cell phone and recorded it. That's the only time that's ever happened to me, but it felt like proof that it felt like proof of that idea that we don't really create music, we just receive it from the ether of humanity's shared history. My God, my teeth, not even my teeth, it's like more my gums hurt. One of my favorite songs in the album is Beethoven's Kant. It's an interesting my teeth. I hate this. It's an interesting progressive rock tune, but part of the reason I love it so much is that I was able to smuggle the word cunt into its title. It's a harsh word and it's real taboo in the US, but I'd always hated the idea of using certain words somehow being out of bounds. By 2007, I was spending a lot of time in New Zealand after falling in love with the place of my first visit. I was trying to establish residency, which required spending at least 3 months there, uninterrupted for a couple of years. In Australia and New Zealand, the word cunt carries a much different connotation than it does in the US. And in fact, it's often a more positive. A top cunt is a good friend, a sick cunt is an icon, and to call a group of people cunts is a term of affection. When it came to the time to start putting together a touring band, I called them the FCC, which the name, of course, was a play on the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates the public airwaves in the U.S. But the acronym FCC actually stands for the Flying Cunts of Chaos, In 2011, we were performing The Tonight Show with Jay Leno on a night when one of his other guests was Robin Williams. I met Robin backstage. He was pretty subdued, particularly per, hello, particularly oh my fucking god, it's just I've said this word so many times. Particularly in comparison on his frantic stage presence, until I told him the name of my bed. Once I did, it was as if I freed the genie out of the bottle. He went running down the hallway out of his studio, shouting, Jay, the flying cunts of chaos are here. I considered that much of a ringing endorsement for the name there could possibly be. Elect the Dead is a rock album, and out of all the albums I made as a solo artist, likely closest what we did in System, which I suppose makes sense since it was only a year or so since I was only a year or so removed from being in the band when I made it. The album did well. It sold over 1 million copies. Empty Walls was played a lot on the radio, and when we went on tour, first playing theaters and then opening for Foo Fighters on an arena tour, the response was amazing. Touring as a solo artist was different than touring with the band. It was my name on a marquee, so whatever pressure existed was squarely on me. But I got to make all of the decisions, too. It was wonderful. Oddly enough, life on tour felt more social as a solo artist than it had with my recent years in System. We were all in one bus as opposed to multiple buses or flying between dates with System, and in that sense that we were out there together working hard to try and win people over fostered a camaraderie I hadn't felt in years. None of this changed the fact that I couldn't sleep on a tour bus or that every day on a tour felt like a barely altered version of the day before it, but it still made it all more bearable and occasionally quite enjoyable. Still, when I was offered the support slot on a Metallica tour in 2008, I turned it down even though it was a great opportunity. I was completely fried from touring and ready to be done with it. The success of Elect the Dead also hit me differently than any of our other highs in System. Although I'd long maintained that I didn't really care much about selling CDs or concert tickets or getting my songs on the radio, that is obviously quite an easier stance to take when you have in fact already sold lots of CDs and concert tickets and had your songs on the radio. After all those years of having Darren and the guys treat my musical songwriting dismissively in System, I think it helped to have some sort of outside validation. It filled me with confidence not only in my musical abilities but also in my own power of artistic discernment. I had something to prove, not to anyone else but to myself. If I could do it without the band, and by it, I don't simply mean commercial success. I mean by making a good album, putting together that band that gets along, mounting a tour I actually enjoyed, and coming away from all of that more energized to make music than I'd been when it started. The experience changed the way I thought about System, but it also changed the way I thought about the kind of music I wanted to make going forward. The reaction to music or any kind of art might be interesting. It might make you feel good, but it should never be the only reason why you make it. A year or so after we finished the Elect the Dead tour, I was offered a chance to perform the album live with the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra in New Zealand. I'd written some rudimentary string and brass sections for System songs in the past, but I had never taken on a project like this. I was immediately fired up to the challenge. I wrote some basic parts, then was introduced to an amazing Greek-Kiwi composer named John Sathas, who had first helped me flesh out the arrangements. I would take the stems out of the song from Elect the Dead, then strip them down to just acoustic guitar and vocals, or piano and vocals. Then I'd add strings and brass lines. Basically, I was losing the band and building an orchestra, but I didn't have the experience at that point where I could go much beyond rudimentary orchestration. So that's where Sathas came in to build the arrangements into something bigger and fuller. I wanted to record the show with an eye on maybe releasing it, but it was going to be a costly endeavor, something on the order of $60,000. I pitched Warner's. Excuse me. I pitched Warner's my own pocket if they balked. They didn't. They didn't. The day of the show was a little nerve-wracking. There was an issue with the soundtrack, and although the show itself went great, the recording quality was subpar. I sent the tracks to a bunch of world-class mixers to try and fix it, and although they'd improved the audio a bit, it was still not great. Finally, I'd send it to Tom Holkenborg, the Dutch DJ producer slash composer who records under the name Junkie XL. He stripped down the whole thing, then put it back together and magically fixed the problem. I am forever in his debt for that. It's the mix you can hear on Elect the Dead Sympathy album and the DVD that came out in 2009. Having sung in front of smaller bands for so many years, the feeling of being on stage surrounded by power and grace of an entire symphony orchestra is invigorating. I was anxious to repeat it, and in 2010, I was anxious to repeat it, and in 2010 and later again in 2013, I organized short tours, mostly through Europe and Russia, playing with a local orchestra in each country. I could really see that the musical and temper. I could really see the musical and temperamental differences between countries manifest themselves. We typically show up in a town a couple days before the performance and would have rehearsals in the orchestra. The ensembles in Eastern Europe, places like Germany, Austria, Poland, and Russia, were on point and disciplined. You gave them charts, they could play them flawlessly. In St. Petersburg, the orchestra was tight, talented, and meticulous. When the conductor put down his baton, everyone followed his lead and stopped playing on a dime. That was a great performance. In Italy, they had a great emotive soloist, but as a group, they couldn't always hold it together. The worst show of that run was in Atlanta. The venue was beautiful, a tiered outdoor amphitheater built into a hill, and the orchestra itself was reasonably capable, although the players themselves were mostly on the older side and didn't have much of a feel for the songs. It didn't help that we flown in a direction from Rome and had no chance to rehearse. Um, Even with all those things working against us, the show might have been salage, salvageable if not for the one element that you can never totally control, the audience. The venue was filled with people who were diehard fans of both System and my solo album, but I'm pretty sure none of them have ever been in the presence of a violin or cello. So as coterie of aging, formerly clad classical musicians who are struggling to follow along with arrangements, long-haired yahoos in the back, concert back, in black concert t-shirts pressed themselves towards me against the front row, double fisting beers, pounding on stage and shouting for us to play Sugar or Chop Suey. It was, oh my god, I think I'm done. I can't, the stream is going horribly as well. So, yeah.